Hey, today we're talking about 11 terms you need to know if you want to be a successful real estate investor. And before you start the video, get this. I want to let you know that if you know these terms, you're already further ahead than I was. So when I first started in real estate when I was 26 years old, I didn't know anything about real estate. And if you asked me what these terms was, I wouldn't be able to give you an answer. So just know if you already know something, you're already further ahead than me. And I've already been involved with over $1 billion worth of real estate transactions in my career. So hey, if you're further ahead of me, you need to just keep going. All right, so let's get started. And today we're talking about the 11 terms that you must need to know in order you to start investing in real estate. And the first term is purchase price. Now this may seem simple and basic, but it wasn't for me when I first started. So the purchase price is the price of the home that is finalized between the seller and the buyer. This is not the asking price or the offer price. So what do I mean by that? So the purchase price is your actual number that both the seller and the buyer confirm on both sides that yes, this is what we're agreeing to in terms of the transacting of the deal. Some backstory about me: when I first started getting real estate, I didn't know any of this. If you say, what's the purchase price? I had no idea. I just thought the asking price was the purchase price that you couldn't negotiate. And if they're asking for $200,000, that's just what it was. And I only learned this lesson because I'd go to the bank and they'd be like, what did you purchase? You purchased the property. Like, they're asking $200,000 and they say, what did you purchase it for? Like, $200,000? And they're just like, well, did you get it for $200,000? I'm like, I haven't got the deal yet. So they're like, what are you doing here? Well, I'm trying to get financing for $200,000. They're like, did you buy it? I'm like, well, I'm going to. So you got to remember, I had no idea what I was doing. So I was incredibly embarrassed on pretty much every step along the way when it came to real estate investing. But I learned the hard way, and I'm here to show you don't have to be embarrassed when you get involved with this. If you just watch this short video and these terminology, if you learn the terminology, which are relatively basic terms, then you'll get to understand, hey, you can speak like a seasoned investor, okay? So the purchase price is basically what you physically, on a contract, agree to a seller to purchase a property at. So let's say they're asking $220,000, you offer them $180,000, but the purchase price is what you both agreed to and settle on at $200,000. That is what we call purchase price. Now the next one is your down payment. So down payment is the amount of money needed if financing, so if you're going to put a mortgage on the property, if financing the purchase price and the mortgage amount or the debt amount. So the debt can also be in other forms other than mortgage, but it's whatever the balance is between your purchase price and the debt owing. That is what we call your down payment. That difference is your down payment. This is not a deposit, yet this is a kind of a bonus term, deposit. So deposit generally is given at the time of an offer. So if you're buying a property, you give an offer to the seller. Within that offer, there's a deposit. It's a good faith deposit saying, yes, I will proceed to close the property. So in their example of let's call it $200,000, if you give them an offering of $180,000, with that $180,000 offering, you're going to give them a $5,000 deposit. You both settle on $200,000 purchase price. Then you're going to go to a debt or a financer and say, I need a balance here. And they're going to say, you need $80,000 down payment because that's all we're going to give you in terms of what the debt is. So that is what down payment is. It is basically the difference between you purchased the property for and what the difference is in terms of what you're going to finance the property. So what you need in between is what we call a down payment. Now the third one is the balance of purchase price. So it's the amount of money needed for the purchase after the down payment. Typically it's financed for investment properties. Cash buyers do not need a mortgage for the balance. And what that is simply means is the balance of purchase price after you've given the down payment. So in our example of $200,000, let's say, and you're going to put down $40,000 down payment. Well, you would need a $160,000 mortgage if you're going to get financing. If you're not going to get financing, you need to come up with $160,000 before closing. In fact, you really don't need a down payment if you're paying cash. You just give a deposit, and then after the deposit, if you're paying cash, then on closing, you just pay the full balance of purchase price. That's basically whatever amount is owing after what you've given to the seller prior to closing. Now, equity, this is what I love, because equity is really how you make wealth in real estate. So the more equity you have is what you would get, essentially what is the net amount of money you get in your pocket after a discharge of a property, after something you sold. So it's the amount of money built up in a property. And if you have cash flow properties or rental properties, this is what builds up long over time. So a tenant's going to pay down your mortgage. The property is going to appreciate in value over time. And the difference between the debt owing on a property and the current value of the property is something what we call equity. And that is the difference between the debt and the value of the property. This is not the value of the property. So look, in my example, when I first got started in real estate investing, I didn't know any of these terms. I had no idea what I was talking about. People would have these conversations with me and it would just go in one ear and out the next. People say, oh, how much equity do you have? I'm like, $500,000? They're like, $500,000? It's not even worth $500,000. I'm like, well, what do you mean by equity? Well, it's, if you sold the property today, what would you get in terms of a check in your hand? I'm like, don't I get the whole amount? They're like, no, you got to pay off the debt. You got to pay off brokerage. You got to pay legal fees. The net amount after all sales proceeds and debt owing, that is what we call your equity. Now, the next term is what we call your mortgage. Now, mortgage is the amount of money given to a purchaser by a financer for the balance of the purchase price. And this can be financed from a bank, private, or partners. You don't have to get it from a bank. Now, a mortgage is generally used, it's the beauty about real estate. It allows you for leverage. So you can put a little bit of money down and then you can mortgage the rest of what's owing to a seller. And that amount of money is what we call a mortgage. So a mortgage goes on the property and it's there for you to pay off over long periods of time. Now, when it comes to mortgaging, that's a different video and it's like a topic for an entire day. I just want you to know what the terminology is. So if you're buying a property for, let's say, $400,000 and you put $100,000 as a down payment, then the balance in this scenario would be $300,000 owed to the seller. So most people in real estate, they would take $300,000 from a bank and the bank would put a mortgage on the property. So it's the debt owing to the bank is what we call a mortgage. Next term is what we call rental rate. So it's the amount of money collected each month from the property that you charge to a tenant, ideally covering your carrying costs, the mortgages, taxes, and interest amount. Now, rental rate, again, this is another term I had to learn the hard way. I had no clue what I was doing. But, finance guys or mortgage people or the banks would say, what's the rental rate of the property? I'd say, as much as I can get. I had no idea what they were talking about. So rental rate simply means the rent. What are you charging per month for the property to a tenant, prospective tenant? That's rental rate. Now, cash flow related to rental rate is the amount of money after you deduct from your rental rate the carrying costs. And the carrying cost typically is, your mortgage, your property taxes, your interest in your insurance, and sometimes property management. The balance, if there is one, is what we call cash flow. Now, if it's positive cash flow, that means after you charge the rental rate, you get that in your bank, some expenses come off of the rental rate. Anything left over, if it's a positive number in your bank account, is what we call positive cash flow. That's what you're looking for. That's a true, that's a great investment property if it's positive cash flow. If it's negative cash flow, that means that the rental rate doesn't cover the carrying costs. So the cost to borrow money on the property, the cost of property taxes and interest and insurance and all that maintenance. So all that deduction, if you're left with a negative in your bank account each month, that is a negative cash flow. Not ideal. I have negative cash flow properties, but I own them for other reasons. So depending on what market you're in, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but depending on what market you're in, if it's negative cash flow, but if it's appreciating, so the value of the property is going up higher than a rental rate, then you have to take that in consideration of what you're owning. Most of my cash flow long-term rental properties are cash flow positive. So after the tenant gives me the monthly rent, I pay the expenses, there's money left over for me at the end of the month to do whatever I want with. And that's what positive cash flow is. Now, the next one is what we call the sales price. Again, this goes back to my earlier example. When I first got into real estate, I had no clue what these terms were. So I couldn't even have a conversation with a banker, a partner, a joint venture person. Most sellers, I had no clue what I was talking about. But it's the amount of money the buyer and seller contractually agree, and I strongly reiterate contractually agree to transfer property from one party to another. This is not a handshake agreement. This is not a verbal agreement. And I learned this one the hard way, unfortunately. But the sales price or your purchase price is the amount of money that both parties have agreed to. Now, on the day of closing, There are potentially some adjustments and disbursements and concessions, but at the end of the day, the sales price is the amount contractually agreed upon. One of the early properties that I tried to buy was from a gentleman. I think he was, if I remember correctly, he was representing himself. There was no agents involved. So I was just going to him directly. He had a sign on his lawn saying house for sale. And I went up to buy this property, and he was asking at the time $280,000. And, through the basic research I was doing, I knew it was a good deal at $280,000. And through further conversations with this gentleman, I was like, why do you want to sell for $280,000? And he's like, well, he goes, I don't want to pay realtor fees, and this is kind of the net amount, and that's what I'm looking for, $280,000. So I said, look, if I offered you $265,000, would you take the deal? And there was like a few weeks of back and forth of like, I visit him, and he's close to my neighborhood, and I'd see him, he'd walk by, and we talk about it. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, he said, you know what, I'll sell it to you for $265,000. So we verbally agreed on it. So I said, okay, I'll come by tomorrow. I got my lawyer overnight to prepare an offer to purchase the property of $265,000. I go to him the next day. I said, look, this is the offer that we agreed on. And he goes, I'm not selling you for $265,000. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, I was like, we talked about this yesterday. He goes, yeah, I remember. I'm like, what? I'm confused. He goes, well, that's not what I want. I want $280,000. I'm like, okay, so if I change this to $280,000, would you agree to that? He goes, yeah, I'd agree to that. Did he sign? Absolutely not. Did I ever get the property? Absolutely not. So who knows what was going on with that property? But even if it was just verbally agreed upon, it still doesn't count. You need it in writing. Closing fees. So if you're in the business of what I'm in, which is a lot of flipping real estate, you're going to get to a point where you have closing fees. So you're going to buy a property, hold it for a period of time, and then eventually sell the property. Now, selling an asset costs money. You're going to have closing transaction fees. They typically cost realtor fees, legal fees, and lender fees. But if you're following me, you understand that everything here on a closing fees is negotiable. Yes, realtor fees are negotiable, legal fees are negotiable, lender fees are negotiable. The best thing you can do when it comes to especially lenders is you can negotiate with them and say, hey, I'm using this money, I'm going to put it into another property, don't charge me the 1% closing fee. If you have a lawyer's like, hey, my rates have gone up from $1,000 to $2,000 on this transaction. Say, okay, see you later. I'm going to go to the next guy, or you negotiate with them and go and bring that back down. So at the end of the day, all these are negotiable. And realtor fees, they're negotiable for sure. Like that's no brainer, but you should negotiate that up front. So generally what happens is you'll negotiate, there's generally two transactions. There's a selling side fee, and then there's a cooperating broker or a buyer broker fee. And both of those fees can be negotiated at different times. And what I mean by that is the listing fee, before you list the property for sale, you can negotiate with the selling agent. Say, instead of paying your 2.5% to 3% fee, I want you to do it for 1% or 1.5%. Okay, so all these are negotiable. And that's prior to listing it. And then once it's sold, the purchaser agent who comes to give you the offer based on what the offer is. I'll give you a great example. We were selling a property not too long ago, actually. It was for $850, something like that. We were asking $900. They were negotiating it down. We came back up to $875, but my condition was it'd be $875 with no buyer's commission. So they were up. It was up to the purchaser if they really wanted the property. They'd have to pay their own buyer's agent, and sure enough, they did. So they wanted the property. The sales price was $875, and they paid their own cooperating agent for the transaction. So that's how you negotiate those. Now, next one is what we call concessions, which is kind of an extension of the closing. So on closing or just prior to closing, usually 2 weeks ahead of time, there's concessions. And concessions is the amount of money buyers and sellers agree to in order to close a deal. So this doesn't always happen. In my own personal experience, I'd say less than 20%, less than 15% of transactions actually have concession fees. And what this is we'll sell a property, or we'll renovate a property, fix a property, and sell the property. And then the concession fees, well, the buyer says in 2 weeks prior to closing, say, hey, I want my closing moved up or back. Typically, it's usually back. But let's say they want to move it back. I'll say, okay, for an extra $2,000, I'll move the closing back 2 weeks because it's going to cost me $2,000. So there's a concession to the purchaser in that case. There's a lot of, generally what concessions come into play is of the property itself. If there's something that needs to be fixed, or maybe something was broken from the time you purchase it to the time closing occurred, maybe there's a scratch on the wall or a scratch on the floor, or maybe an appliance isn't working anymore. So the seller and buyer would say, hey, give me a concession. If I'm the buyer, it's like, give me a concession of $5,000. You don't have to fix the appliance. I'll get new appliances at my expense, but I want another further $5,000 reduction on the sales price. And that's what we call a concession, which is lumped into what we call disbursements, but it's just part of the closing fees, the overall closing fees. And of course, last but not least is profit. So profit is the amount of money a project makes you after all expenses have been paid. So it's the sales price minus your purchase price minus your closing fees, and concessions will equal your profit. So again, I have been through the ringer when it comes to real estate, because I started with literally zero knowledge. I didn't start that long ago, in my own opinion, but it was, over 20 years ago. And there are textbooks and there was some like books out there on real estate, but really not a lot of information. And it was really who you knew. It was like, if you had a mentor, if you had somebody showing you the way, or a parent or someone, they would have taught you all of this. But me, I had no clue. So funny story, when my first property ever I purchased and sold, my lawyer was like, how much profit are you making on this and what are you going to do with it? And I said to him, I originally bought it for $220,000, I sold it for $330,000. So the profit was $110,000 gross prior to closing fees and adjustments. And I said, I'm making $330,000 of profit. And he looked at me with like, I had three heads. He goes, you sold it for $330,000. I was like, yeah, that's my profit. He goes, no, that's not what you're making. You have to pay the bank, and you got to pay me, and you got to pay this fee and that fee and realtor fees. I'm like, oh. So I had no idea what it was, but that's what profit is. It's just after everything is paid out, what is it you get in your hand? What's the actual amount of money? That's what your profit is. Now, I want to give you a real world scenario. And this is, now that you've understood these terminologies, and feel free to go back, rewatch this video. If you know some terms or forgot some terms, go back to it. If you already know some, just fast forward. I won't be offended if you do. But let's say you are now a real estate investor, or want to be a real estate investor on your first one. You will now be able to have a conversation with someone, whether it's a partner, a joint venture partner, a finance person, a realtor. This is what a real case scenario would look like of how you can have a conversation with someone. Let's say I'm talking to my lender, and they're going to say, what do you want to do with the property? Well, I purchased a property for $400,000. I'm going to put down a down payment of $80,000. My balance due is going to be $320,000 prior to closing. So I'm going to need a mortgage of $320,000. What do you want to do with the property? Well, my intention is to keep it for a few years. I would like to sell the property for $500,000. Over the course of 5 years, my mortgage pay down is going to pay down $20,000. So the mortgage owing will be $300,000 to the bank. On the amount of time I'm going to own it, I'm going to rent out the property. So my rental rate is going to be $2,200 a month. After all expenses, it's going to be positive cash flow property of $250 per month to me. I'm going to sell it for $500,000. There's going to be some closing fees on the $500,000 of $15,000 for realtor fees and legal fees and lending fees. And the purchaser, for some reason, wanted this, that, and the other fix, and I didn't want to do it. So we had a concession of $5,000 to the purchaser. So my net profit total amount was $180,000 on this property. I purchased it for $400,000. I held it for 5 years, and I profited $180,000. So that's how the conversation goes, and that is how you need to speak to people if you want to not look embarrassed like I did when I was 26 years old and not knowing half this information. So that's my gift to you today, because hey, look, I really wish I had this 20 years ago, but I didn't. But now you have it. Enjoy it. Go out there and start happy hunting in real estate.